The Pentagon's small, windowless conference rooms were usually silent at this hour, but Colin Powell paused when he noticed a single folder left on the center table. The NATO briefing looked routine until he turned to page 3. A new line typed in clean, deliberate text replaced an entire paragraph. The vote will shift at dawn. The room had been locked all night. Powell held the briefing note under the dim conference light, reading the altered line again as if repetition might expose its author. The rest of the document was standard, predictable language, cautious assessments, nothing unusual. But the substituted sentence carried a different gravity. It wasn't analysis. It wasn't speculation. It was a declaration, written with the confidence of someone who understood how NATO decisions actually shifted, quietly through hands not listed on the schedule. He set the page down, flattening it against the table. The paper was warm, not from the room, which was uncomfortably cold, but from recent handling. Someone had stood exactly where he was standing, leaning forward just long enough to replace a page with surgical precision. Powell scanned the edges. No crease, no torn fibers. The substitute sheet had been trimmed to match the original. He moved around the table, checking the room's small details. A chair slightly angled away from its usual alignment. A pen cap lying a few inches from its pen, as if set down without thought. A faint indentation on the carpet, near the projector stand, fresh, shallow, left by a single foot that hadn't stayed long. Powell checked the electronic lock panel beside the door. The last recorded entry time was 2014. No additional entries, but page 3 had been altered hours later. Someone had come in without opening the door, or someone with access had chosen not to be seen. Powell stepped back from the lock panel and let his eyes adjust to the stillness of the hallway outside. The corridor was empty, lit by the soft hum of overnight power-saving lights. Nothing about the space suggested unauthorized movement. No open doors, no hurried footsteps, no signs of a visitor who should not exist. Yet the briefing note in his hand contradicted every piece of physical evidence. He returned to the table and examined the folder once more. The altered page wasn't simply inserted. It had been integrated, aligned perfectly with the staple holes, the margins, the weight of the other sheets. Someone had taken time, care, and most importantly, certainty. This wasn't an act of mischief or error. It was intent. Powell slid the chair aside and lowered himself slightly to inspect beneath the table edge. There, barely visible in the shadowed underside, was a small smudge, an almost invisible mark left by the heel of a hand bracing against the wood. Not panic, not haste, a quiet adjustment of posture. Someone had worked here calmly. He straightened and scanned the ceiling corners. The room was equipped with a standard security camera, angled toward the entrance, not toward the table. The blind spot was known only to staff who'd used this room often. Powell had used it. Other senior officers had too. But that list was small, and most of them were accounted for tonight. He checked the wall clock, 03:26. Dawn was still hours away. If the vote truly would shift at that hour, someone was preparing the ground long before the decision-makers woke. And they had chosen Powell's room, not another, to make that clear. Powell stood still, letting the quiet press against him. The small conference room was always a neutral space. Sterile walls, static air, no personality, yet tonight it felt arranged, not staged, not theatrical, but structured, as if someone had shaped the room's details the way a strategist shapes a briefing by subtraction rather than addition. He moved to the corner where a rolling whiteboard stood unused. Its wheels were angled slightly outward, leaving faint tracks on the carpet. Someone had shifted it recently, but not enough to write on it. More like someone had pushed it aside to make space precise, unobtrusive, intentional. Powell turned his attention to the far wall. The drab paint reflected the overhead lights in a dull, even tone, except for a narrow section near the floor, where the reflection bent. He crouched, tracing his fingers along the baseboard. A small fiber, dark, thread-like, rested on the molding. Fabric. Suit material. High-quality weave. Not from him. not from the night staff. He rose and looked again at the altered note. The vote will shift at dawn. It wasn't a forecast. It wasn't an assessment. It read like a confirmation delivered before the event, not after. NATO decisions rarely moved in single strokes. They drifted through alliances, phone calls, late-night compromises. A shift implied leverage, pressure, a hand unseen. Powell exhaled slowly. Whoever left the message wasn't warning him about the vote. They were demonstrating proximity to it. The room wasn't a crime scene. It was an introduction. Powell stepped back toward the door. Not to leave, but to reconsider the room as a whole. The layout, the angles, the left-behind details, none of them pointed to intrusion. They pointed to access, the kind granted to people who could walk through the Pentagon without raising questions, who moved with the assurance of belonging, the kind who didn't need to break locks because the locks already knew them. He returned to the folder, lifting the altered sheet by its corner. A faint scent rose from it. Not cologne, not paper dust. Something more sterile, like the remnants of a toner cartridge, or a freshly opened ream. The page had been printed recently, maybe within the last hour, but no printer in this wing was active. He checked the footer, no timestamp, no routing code, no internal signature. Someone had gone to great lengths to make the page blend in, but not to hide the message. Powell's attention drifted toward the small vent above the projector stand. The grill was slightly misaligned, no more than a millimeter. He climbed onto the edge of the chair and lifted it gently. Inside, resting on top of the duct, lay a thin folded strip of plastic, a cut section of a lamination sleeve, the kind used for classified briefing covers. It wasn't attached to anything. It had simply been left. He held it to the light. The edge was smooth except for one corner, which carried the faintest indentation as though pressed by a thumb while being torn. A fragment, a presence, a reminder. Powell lowered the grill and stepped back down. The message on page 3 wasn't asking him to decode anything. It was asking him to recognize that someone had already worked inside the briefing chain, unseen and unchallenged, and they wanted him to know they were close enough to reach it. Powell slipped the fragment of plastic into the folder and closed it quietly, as though sealing a conversation he had never agreed to start. The air in the room felt heavier now, not tense, not dangerous, but purposeful, as if someone had set the conditions and was waiting to see how he moved through them. He walked to the door but didn't exit. Instead, he paused and turned back. Something still felt offset, incomplete, as though the room held one more detail, arranged with the same subtle precision as the altered page. His gaze drifted across the table edge, the chairs, the floor, and then settled on the light switch. It was smudged, not noticeably, not enough for anyone rushing through a typical day to catch. But there, along the plastic frame, was a narrow crescent-shaped fingerprint pressed lightly, then pulled away. Powell leaned in. The print wasn't from a bare hand. It bore the faint straight-line texture of a glove, a thin, tactical glove. The kind worn not by maintenance crews or clerks, but by personnel accustomed to handling sensitive material without transferring residue. Someone had been careful, but not careful enough to remove every trace. Powell straightened and opened the door fully, stepping into the corridor's cooler air. The hallway ran quiet as a sealed file drawer. Far down the line, a row of office windows reflected the low overnight lighting, turning the space into a muted channel of pale surfaces and sharp silhouettes. He closed the conference door behind him. No alarm triggered. No camera shifted its lens. The building did not acknowledge his movement, but he sensed that someone else did. Whatever force had altered the NATO briefing wasn't improvising. It was preparing. Powell walked down the corridor with the kind of steady pace that drew no attention yet left nothing unnoticed. The wing was quiet, too quiet for a floor that typically carried at least a few late-shift analysts. Doors he expected to see cracked open were shut. Office lights that usually glowed faintly behind frosted glass were dark. It wasn't abandonment, it was alignment. Someone had cleared the path ahead of him with the same precision used to alter the briefing. As he reached the corner, he noticed a thin line of light beneath a door marked for a small liaison office, a room used for interagency notes, most of them routine. The door was closed, but the light was the kind produced by a desk lamp, not overhead fluorescence. Powell placed his hand on the knob. Warm. He opened the door quietly. Inside, the lamp illuminated a single object lying at the center of the desk, a NATO decision rating sheet. But it wasn't the matrix itself that caught his attention. It was the annotation in the margin. A short, deliberate mark like a check symbol, drawn with a pen that barely left indentation. The check aligned perfectly beside a line referencing procedural flexibility and consensus timing. A subtle phrase, meaningless to most, not meaningless to him. He leaned closer. The ink was fresh. Someone had stood here minutes ago. Powell scanned the room. The chair was angled slightly away from the desk, the kind of angle a person leaves behind when rising with controlled urgency. A faint indentation on the carpet showed where a second foot had pivoted. No frantic movement, no disturbance. A visitor who knew how to leave without announcing that they'd entered. He lifted the annotated sheet. The checkmark pointed not to a specific nation, but to a timing clause, just as the altered page in the conference room had referenced dawn. Patterns weren't emerging, they were already in place. Someone wasn't predicting the vote shift. Someone was arranging it. Powell set the annotated matrix back on the desk, aligning its edges with the precision of someone who understood that order could be a language. Then he turned off the lamp. Darkness folded back over the room. But the silence lingered with a shape structured, purposeful, a silence left behind by someone accustomed to moving through institutions without being recorded by them. He stepped into the hallway again. The door clicked shut, soft and final. As Powell walked, the building's temperature shifted in subtle gradients, pockets of cool air followed by stillness, then warmths, signatures of recently opened doors, freshly closed vents and hurried adjustments to the environment. Someone ahead of him was either one step too fast or one step too close. At the next junction, Powell noticed a discrepancy, a single briefing cart parked against the wall. It held no folders, no binders, nothing except one object placed squarely at its center, a clipped corner of a NATO routing sheet, torn cleanly. The corner bore a routing prefix he recognized, Brussels liaison, but the numbers following it had been scratched out with a single diagonal stroke, not erased, negated. Powell picked up the fragment. The scratch was recent. Tiny flecks of ink dust clung to the paper fibers. Someone wanted the origin known, but the trail severed. He walked further down the corridor, following the faint drift of conditioned air toward the older section of the floor. There, just before a secured stairwell, he saw something else. The faint glow of a status panel cycling between yellow and green. The lock was in transition, caught between states, because someone had overridden it before the system could register the change. Powell rested a hand on the bar. Still warm. Someone wasn't just shaping access. They were shaping timing. And the closer he came to dawn, the clearer it became. This was not about shifting a vote. It was about revealing who had the power to shift it. Powell pressed the stairwell bar lightly and stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a soft mechanical sigh, muffling the rest of the building. The stairwell was dim, its lights running in low power mode, casting long vertical shadows down the concrete walls. Yet something in the stillness felt newly disturbed, as though the air carried the afterglow of a passing presence. He descended one flight. On the landing he found a small slip of paper resting on the first step, a torn margin from a briefing sheet. Not dropped, placed. The torn edge was perfectly straight, cut with a blade rather than ripped by hand. Powell crouched and turned it over. On the blank side, barely visible, someone had drawn a single vertical line with a pencil, then smudged it with their thumb. A mark of alignment, a continuation of the sequence. He slipped it into his pocket and continued downward. At the next landing he stopped again. The metal railing bore a faint streak near the midpoint, a smear left by a gloved hand descending quickly but without haste. Powell touched the steel, still faintly warm. Not minutes ago. Moments. He looked up the stairwell. Nothing moved. Then down. Only dim light pooling at the base floor. He continued, his steps echoing softly. The stairwell opened into a secondary operations corridor, rarely used outside high-level consultation. It was empty now. The overhead lights dimmed so low they seemed to hesitate before illuminating the floor. At the corridor's end, a door stood slightly ajar. Behind it, a pale blue glow pulsed once, then faded soft as a breath. Powell approached. The glow returned for a fraction of a second, enough to illuminate the edge of a document lying on a desk inside. The same NATO briefing folder. Page 3 missing. Someone wanted him to see what they had taken and what they intended to use before dawn. Powell stepped into the dim operations room, the door easing shut behind him with a muted click. The pale blue glow came from a single monitor left in standby, its screen reflecting off the NATO folder, placed squarely at the center of the desk. Page 3 was gone, cleanly removed, staple holes untouched, as if it had never existed. He reached for the folder. The desk beneath it was warm. Someone had been sitting here only moments earlier. Powell scanned the room. Chairs aligned, binders undisturbed, no signs of intrusion, only the unmistakable residue of presence, an imprint on the fabric of the workspace rather than on its objects. He opened the folder. Inside, a small slip of paper rested where page 3 should have been. A single line typed in the same deliberate font as before. The vote will shift because it already has. Powell exhaled softly, closing the folder with one hand. This wasn't a warning, a threat, or a prediction. It was a statement of completion. Whatever had moved through the building tonight hadn't come to influence the decision. It came to tell him he was already too late to stop it, but not too late to understand it.